So, is this biology? So that's what we're going to be focusing on today. Is we are going to determine if something is living or not living. Biology. What is biology? Biology is the study of life, right? Of living things, right? And that is what biology is. So those questions that we were just asking, are those things living or non-living? And that's what we're going to be focused on today. Anything that is living or can carry on the process of life, we call that an organism. So if somebody call you an organism, that means you are living. You carry the processes of life. Okay. When you have multiple organisms, many organisms that live with each other, and they can also reproduce with each other, we call them species. For example, the human species, for example, right? Because we live with each other, we can also reproduce each other in general, right? The dog species, the cat species, the horse species, because those organisms, they live with each other and they can also reproduce with each other. But if I ask you, is the dog or cat a species, the same species, then the answer is no, right? Because cat and dog cannot reproduce with each other, right? Or if I ask you, is the horse and human the same species, then the answer would be no as well, because horse and human cannot reproduce, have baby with each other, right? Even though online you see that, from Greek mythology, you see the centaur, right? Half man, half horse. And then when you were young, you probably think like, yeah, maybe that is one species, but no, it's a myth, right? But again, for them to be the same species, they have to be able to reproduce with each other, all right? And if we look at all the species we have around the world, it's over 2 million species. And that number will continue to grow because of evolution, how things change. So organisms also change. Life has been traced to over 3.5 billion years old. So our planet is around like 4.5 or 5 billion years old, and life has been there 3.5 billion years. When I talk about life, I'm not talking about human life, right? I'm talking about the first living thing, the smallest living thing, and likely there'll be bacteria, right? And it's been around 3.5 billion years, so it's been a long time. All right, next thing, everybody in the chat box, not in the chat box, in this respond, let me know what makes something living to you. Growth, it can take in oxygen, so it sounds like if they move and take in oxygen, then they are living. All right, so I'm gonna move on. Okay, so today our focus is what are the requirements an organism must meet to be considered living, or an object or something must have to be considered living. Okay, and that's what we're trying to learn today. All right. So the first thing that all living thing, if they're living, must have is made of cells. They need to have cells. What are cells? They are most basic unit of life. They are the smallest thing that make up living things, right? All cells are capable of carrying on life processes. They can live on their own, individual cell. They don't need to be all together, and then they are considered cells. Some cell has a special job. For example, red blood cell carry oxygen in your body. For example, your heart cell help pump, right? They pump. For example, you have skin cell, right? Skin cell, your skin are made of tiny cells that come together. They create a barrier to protect you from pathogen, from viruses or bacteria trying to get inside your body. All right. So the first thing they must have is they must have cell. If they don't have cell, then they are not considered living. And the second thing that they must have is they need to have different level organization. What do I mean by that? That means they need to be organized from the small thing to the bigger thing. For example, in human, the smallest thing is cell, right? And then those cells would come together to make tissue. It's like you have the skin. You have tiny skin cell, and they work together to become skin tissue. And then once you have enough skin tissue, you call that an organ. So our skin is an organ, or a heart, intestine, brain, right? Lungs, those are organs as well. And then you also have different organs that work together to build an organ system, a system. For example, you have your digestive system, right? Food eating. You have the small intestine, large intestine, and you also have the stomach, esophagus. Those make up a digestive system, right? You also have your urinary system, your system that help you to urinate, right? You have the kidney, right? The bladder, right? And then once you have all those different systems come together, you get an organism or a living thing, right? And that's the second requirement. So the first requirement must have cell. Second requirement, they need to have organization. You need to be able to organize from the smallest thing to the bigger thing. All right. And the third thing that it must have is it requires energy, or we call that metabolism. Energy is the ability to do work or cause change, right? This is one of the requirements that sometime during my fifth period, when we were in school, I get really scared because I don't know if some of my students are living or non-living, if they are biology or not, are they living or non-living. That's because they lack energy. When you don't have the energy, you might be considered not living, non-living, right? So yes, you need energy. Most life obtain energy from the sun. For example, grasses, plants, flower. And these guys are called what we call autotroph because they get energy from the sun. How about us? Human, animals, fungi, we are considered heterotroph because we cannot sit in the sun and get our energy. We eat the grass, the plants. We eat other animals to consume our energy. All right. So that's the three things that you need to have to be considered living: cells, okay, organization, and energy. All right. Moving on. And the fourth thing that you also need to have is you need to be able to respond to the environment. You got to respond to the environment. If something come at you, a car hit toward you, a football flying at you, you need to respond to that, and it might risk their life as well. So respond to environment is another requirement to living. Okay. And the last two requirements that any living thing must have are reproduce and develops. What do I mean by reproduce? Reproduce means those organisms must be able to pass on their genetic material or DNA or genetic code to the next generation. We know that human or any animal or any living thing, we don't live forever, right? We don't live for a long, long time, right? If we get to a point, those animals will die, human will die. But how do we still live for many generations is through passing the genetic information to our next generation. For example, your great-great-great-grandparent, I'm sure are not living, right? Unless you still have your great-great-great-great-grandparents that still live, then good for you. But they are not living, but something in them is still living. And that is their DNA. And that's because they reproduce. Does this mean that you're gonna go home and look for your uncle or aunt that cannot have kids or decide not to have kids, and you tell them that they are not living? Of course not, right? I'm talking about in general, right? If that organism cannot reproduce or pass the DNA on to the next generation, then they're not considered living because technically they are dead already, right? But I'm talking about in general, right? So don't go and tell your aunt and uncle that have no kid that they are not considered living, right? All right. When we talk about reproduction, there are two ways that all living things reproduce. One is asexual. That means the offspring come from a single parent. For example, bacteria. They don't need another mate. They don't need the opposite sex. All they have to do is split in half. And from one, split into two. And that's asexual reproduction. We'll talk about that later on. And then the second way is sexual reproduction, like human or other animal. They need opposite sex or mate, right? So that way they can mix their genes. So there are two parents, right? And that's the two type of reproduction. All right, and the last requirement to life is what we call develop. You must be able to develop and grow. Like you guys don't stay in the same kindergarten shape or mentally stay the same. You have to grow and develop. And that's important to be considered living, right? Like you have to grow mentally as well, not physically as only, mentally as well. Because if you don't grow mentally, then that could, something could happen in your life and it could risk your life and it could affect if you're living or not living. Then of course you write a summary at the end, make sure you summarize what are the, something is considered living or non-living. How do you know it's biology or no biology? All right, so make sure you do that. So that's it. Thank you for participating in the Paradeck again. I'm gonna end it. So